Welcome, my children. Come in shorts and t-shirt. I'm in 3 layers. I'm freezing. All right. Good evening. I think we're live, right? Not yet? Should be. Coming up. All right. Chapter 11 continues Daniel's fourth and last vision. That began in chapter 10. And as I noted last week, according to Walvoord, he gave you a little outline of these last 3 chapters. 2 major divisions. The first is what we'll do tonight. 11, 2 through 35 deals with the immediate future from Darius to Antiochus. That's Antiochus the Epiphanes. And second, 36 through 12:4 with the far future, the end times just before the advent of Christ. Now, I'll just say that's Walvoord's opinion. It's not everybody's opinion. So when we get into this tonight, it's going to be, what we're going to see is very specific prophecy unfolding, and so specific that many critics have maintained that it's impossible for there to be this kind of accuracy with prophecy. It's impossible. Now, this is coming even from Christians to say this, that this kind of accuracy to be for Daniel to have written it in the 6th century BC. In their minds, it must have been a Second Temple period document, and if that's the case, Daniel would not be the one who prophesied these things under the inspiration of the vision that God provided him through that angelic messenger. I think, first of all, before I get to the next line, let me just say nothing's impossible with God. So for any Christian to say that it's impossible for this to have been written in the 6th century, come on. Then next, I think, in my opinion, the only evidence needed for me for the legitimacy of Daniel's prophecy in the 6th century is Jesus' words in the Gospel of Matthew. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet. For Jesus to say, through Daniel the prophet, to me, solidifies the fact that Daniel prophesied. We know Daniel lived in the 6th century. Daniel didn't live in the 2nd century. We know that. So I think it's pretty clear to me, at least my little brain, to understand that. Okay, so here we go. 45 verses, 14 pages. Let's see how we do on time. A lot of history. This is mainly history tonight. Okay, verse 1. In the first year of, notice verse 1 continues from verse 21 of chapter 10. It's still the same speaker. It's that angelic watcher, that angelic visitor, some type of archangel or some type of messenger there that's unfolding all these things to Daniel. And he says, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And so there are scholars who do believe that this angel is indeed Gabriel. My own opinion, I think that Daniel or the Lord would have named Gabriel because he was named in chapters 8 and 9. So I just don't think so. But again, can't be dogmatic about that. But the question that arises from this verse is, who is the him that the angel is talking about? In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. Who's the him? Immediately you think, well, he's talking about Darius because that's the kind of the last thing mentioned. But it seems logical that the him refers to the angel Michael from 1021, remembering that it's kind of one thought. So most scholars believe the chapter division to be one verse too early and that this really falls in chapter 10. And if that was the case, if you just kind of read them together, it makes sense to think that the him, the encouragement and protection was for Michael. Not in none of the sense of support, maybe a better word. Yeah, good point. Maybe not protection. I didn't look at that word. I can look at that real quick and see. Let's see. The word, it could even mean a place of rest, a place of safety, a refuge, a shelter. You could even think of that as a relief or a break, is even how that word can be looked at. So Wendy Witter writes this. She said, it seems plausible that Michael could have had his hands full in the heavenly realms as Cyrus contemplated his important decree on earth, and the man of Daniel's vision helped wage heavenly war on behalf of God's exiled people who were on the cusp of being allowed to return to the land. So just knowing the situation that was being fought over, that might can give some context there too. Verse 2, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. Couple of problems with this. One, there were multiple kings in Persia besides just 4. There were multiple kings during this time span that's being looked at here. But scholars are pretty much in agreement that the 4 kings are Cambyses or Cambyses. That would be Cyrus's son. Pseudo-Smyrtus. It's a great name. Think about it, going to first grade. What's your name? Pseudo-Smyrtus. Don't go to recess, you get beat up. Darius the Great, who's different from Darius in verse 1, and then Xerxes. Xerxes, we ought to know, Xerxes from the book of Esther. Another name, Ahasuerus, is maybe how the translation is done for him. Xerxes was the king during the time of Esther. So those are believed to be, and scholars are pretty much in agreement that those are the 4 kings that are referred to here. And it has to do with significant things that happened while they were reigning rather than just only there being 4 kings. Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. I found this little book, and I'm quoting him a lot tonight. I had it in my library, and I didn't know. It's The Jews from Cyrus to Herod by Norman Snaith. Another great name, Snaith. Makes me think of Harry Potter. Yeah. But he was principal and tutor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Wesley College in Leeds. And he wrote this great little book, and it operates a lot of history just in these short pages. And so he's very good at being concise. Even more concise is this thin little book from Ironside called The 400 Silent Years. It gives you just a really short, concise overview of that intertestamental period, which a lot of this covers tonight. So those are just, I don't think I quote from Ironside once, but a lot from Snaith. Snaith writes, Cambyses invaded Egypt in 525 BC. He captured the country, made himself king instead of the reigning pharaoh, Psamtik III, and became master as far as the borders of Ethiopia. He was still in Egypt when there was a revolt in Persia in 522 BC. In that year, Cambyses died in Haran, it should be familiar to you, Haran, good biblical city there, on his way home. He died by his own sword. Some say by accident, others say by suicide. The next one, Pseudo-Smyrtus, was a usurper and an impostor. He looked so much like Cambyses that he claimed to be Cambyses, and through all kinds of deception, got himself into the throne. David Jeremiah notes that he gained access to the royal household because he looked like Cambyses' son, and he used his mistaken identity to become king. So just an interesting thing about old Pseudo-Smyrtus. Pseudo being he's fake. That's fake Smyrtus. I don't know if the real Smyrtus is any better, but... Then you have Darius the Great, the next one. Obviously different king than the Darius in the book of Daniel. Again, according to Snaith, Darius continued the tolerant policy of Cyrus in regards to allowing the Jews to worship in Jerusalem. But he made changes of the utmost importance. One innovation was the establishment of the imperial post, by which fast messengers with frequent relays of horses could carry news speedily from one part of the empire to the other, the Pony Express of the ancient world. But the most important change was the policy of ruling through native princes. He divided up the whole empire into 20 provinces, each with a satrap domiciled in the principal city. He was careful, however, to make the satrap a civil governor only, whilst the chief of the military in the satrapy was independent of the governor and answerable to the king direct. It was this change of policy which probably accounts for the disappearance of Zerubbabel as governor of Judah, he being a scion of the house of David. And then he continues, the reign of Darius I, also known as Hystaspes, is notable for the rebuilding of the temple, the foundation being laid in 520 BC, and the whole work being completed in 516 BC. So all that happened under Darius the Great. And then, obviously, there's kings between Darius and Xerxes, but Xerxes is the king mentioned in the book of Esther. John MacArthur writes, he's one of the greatest Oriental rulers of all time. He had fabulous wealth. I'll just tell you, this little paragraph sounds like Donald Trump. It just does. I can't help it. MacArthur wrote it. It's not me. But just listen to it. He had fabulous wealth. He commanded the largest army in the ancient world. He decided he wanted to attack Greece. He was totally and utterly, in a devastating way, defeated by the power of Greece. And the Greeks never forgot about it. It just sounds like, there's another one from MacArthur that sounds like Trump too. But then again, Snaith writes, Darius died in 486 BC, was succeeded by his son Xerxes. That's 485 to 465 BC. This is the Xerxes who invaded Greece and overran Leonidas and his Spartans at Thermopylae in 480 BC. Thermopylae, sorry. I was going for the Latin AE, which is I, but I didn't look it up. Only to lose his fleet at Salamis later in the same year. Xerxes was poisoned in 465 BC, but his third son, Artaxerxes I, Longimanus, that's the one that we talked about back in Daniel chapter 9, about the years and the decree going forth from Artaxerxes. He poisoned the poisoner and established himself as king after an interregnum of some 7 months. Now, just to give you the biblical perspective, aside from the history books on these kings, look at Ezra 4 through 6 there. Then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and frightened them from building, and hired counselors against them to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now in the reign of Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah. All that just to put in at least 3 of those kings, or at least 3 kings in that time period there, to let you know that the Bible's tracking along with this. Verse 3, and a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. Now, before we go too much further into that, one of the reasons why these 4 kings are believed to be so relatively close in proximity is because of the last phrase of verse 2. He will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. So there has to be kind of it's got to set the stage for the entrance here of Greece and Alexander the Great before that. So this mighty king arising in verse 3 is pretty well agreed to be Alexander the Great. Again, Snaith writes, whilst the last Persian kings were poisoning and being poisoned, Philip of Macedon was making ready to destroy the now effete Persian Empire. He envisaged a united Greece which should dominate the whole world. He therefore sought to entice or to compel all the Greek city-states into a Hellenic league, with Macedon, though not herself strictly Greek, should lead to victory. But Philip was murdered in 336 BC before he could realize his ambitions. Now, again, Snaith is an English writer, and so you see there's a Z and not a Z in realize, and my spell check caught that, but I chose to ignore it because that's how Snaith writes. But he says, these were fulfilled by a greater than Philip, and in a far grander way than ever Philip could have dreamed. His son Alexander, barely 19 years old, succeeded to the inheritance and to the task. It was 2 full years before Alexander was able to march against Persia. In 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont and forthwith routed a Persian army of 20,000 foot on the slopes of Mount Ida. It is said that his own losses amounted to 60 horses and 30 foot. This battle gave Alexander the west and the south of Asia Minor. MacArthur adds, maybe this is the one I was thinking, a mighty king, none other than Alexander the Great of Greece. Said he had a great dominion. I'm telling you, the man was a man that stands out in history as perhaps the most remarkable military leader ever. By the age of 33, he had conquered the world. It says in verse 3 that he did according to his will. He was an absolute monarch, absolute sovereign, who had not only the power of personality and the power of leadership, but the power of military might. So, Alexander the Great. Verse 4, but as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. Now keep in mind, if this was written in the 6th century, at least 200 years, probably, almost 200 years, before Alexander the Great even became king, this is prophesied. So the detail of this is astounding. All right, so Alexander's kingdom was not passed to a single successor. As the scripture declares, it was parceled out to the 4 points of the compass. MacArthur explains, a great battle ensued for who was going to rule, and the battle was won by 4 generals, and the kingdom was divided into 4 parts. Cassandra took Macedonia, Lysimachus took Thrace and Asia Minor, Ptolemy took Egypt, and Seleucus took Syria. Egypt is south of Israel, Syria is north of Israel. Those two become the ones we focus on in the remaining of the chapter because they're the ones right around the nation of Israel. And in Egypt, a Ptolemaic line of kings was established, and in Syria, a Seleucid dynasty was established. And through the centuries, those two dynasties warred with each other, and they fought most of their wars on the soil of Israel. So Israel becomes the pawn in this. From here on to the 20th verse, we cover about 200 years when these wars raged on the borders and throughout the land of Israel. Now, notice in the verse, in verse 4, it was parceled out not to his own descendants. MacArthur writes that Alexander had a half-brother who was mentally retarded. He had an illegitimate son, and he had a baby born posthumously. In other words, the baby was born after Alexander died. And all 3 of those were murdered. So he had no posterity at all. One of the greatest military rulers of history had no posterity to pass it on to. Now, this next part will take some time, but I think it's important. It's an important factor in biblical history, which was interesting to me. I don't know how much you know about it. I didn't know much about it. I'd heard it, but I didn't know the detail. The role of Aristotle in the life of Alexander the Great. All right, this is interesting. Again, Snaith writes of Alexander, his conquests are of the utmost importance because they involve the spread of Greek ideas and Greek culture generally. And this to an extent that cannot be overestimated. These ideas form the basis of that Eastern Mediterranean culture which Rome took over from the 2nd century BC onwards. This became the basis of the Roman civilization, and in turn, it has formed the framework of our modern Western world. For all this, we must thank Aristotle. The most important thing that Aristotle ever did was his going to the court of Philip of Macedon in the year 343 BC to be a tutor to the young prince Alexander, then 13 years old. This boy had already learned to love the old Homeric poems, and his first tutor, Lysimachus of Acarnania, had encouraged him in boundless ambitions, even to believing himself a son of the gods. It was left to Aristotle to mold him into the man he became. Aristotle gave to the young Alexander a tremendous love for all things Greek, literature, art, beauty, language, everything. Above all, he imbued him with a great admiration for the Greek style of government. Aristotle was himself expert in the study of political institutions, none more so in his day, nor indeed any as much. The result of all this was that when Alexander set out to conquer the world, he was moved not only by the personal ambitions which he owed to Lysimachus, but also by a strong desire to make real those dreams of the kingdom of man which Aristotle had implanted in him. Snaith's a good writer. This is really good. When his soldiers, either through wounds or through age, could not keep up those tremendous forced marches which were in part the secret of his success, he discharged them in groups. The veterans settled where they were discharged, married native women, and raised Greek families. But each settlement was modeled on the Greek pattern, a small cameo of Greece in a barbarian land. By this means, a common culture was established from east to west and down into Egypt, and it was a Greek culture. And it came about, therefore, that even though Alexander's empire broke up into many pieces at his death, yet every piece was Greek. It mattered not whether Syrian or Egyptian ruled in Palestine, for both Syrians and Egyptians were apostles of the Greek way of life. I think that's important to recognize on not only the immediate context and what happens over the next 200 years, but really on into the first century and on into the New Testament, because it was really Alexander the Great's influence and this important mission, if you want to call it that he had, that was maybe spurred on by Aristotle and others, that really set the stage for the first century to be just the right time when God would send his son into the world, at a place where the world could speak one language, at a place where roads were made into the different continents and travel was made possible. And this way of life became so widespread that it created a culture that allowed those things to come to be. So I think that's a very important piece of history.
And the Greeks were very spiritual people.
They were. Yeah, they're spiritual people, David said. Maybe in a multiple God kind of way, a polytheism.
In spiritual things. So.
Very much so. Interested in spiritual things, yes. Paul at Athens would be a great example. And that was Roman, but but that has its roots in Greece.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, verse 5. Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His domain will be a great dominion indeed. Now, about this, you'll see throughout that, and I think I mentioned this later on, but when we have these seems like specific titles, King of the South, King of the North, they're not, from the rest of this chapter, it's not necessarily referring to or it doesn't mean the same person all throughout the chapter. It's whoever is the king of the south at the time, whoever is the king of the north at the time. So the rulers can change, their territory doesn't. Okay. MacArthur noted the rest of the chapter covers 200 years of history. Oh, there it is. So the king of the south is not just one king; it's a dynasty. But we will see some specifics. All right. So this king of the south, that would be the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemaic dynasty ruling in Egypt, south of Israel, that one that went to that general Ptolemy from Alexander's division there. And it says that the king of the south will grow strong. MacArthur notes the Ptolemaic dynasty starts out a little more powerful, but it doesn't take very long until the north becomes more powerful as the expansion of the north develops. Finally, the two realize the tension that's existing. And so in verse 6, getting a little ahead of ourselves, well, not really. In verse 6, it says they're going to make an alliance. And how do they do it? This was the old way to make an alliance. The king's daughter of the south comes to the king of the north to make an agreement. You give your daughter to the nation you want to make a treaty with. She marries the guy, and you hope that makes the right kind of relationship. And that's exactly what happened. Antiochus Theos, Antiochus the god, what that means, who was the third king of Syria, needed to make a treaty with Egypt. The king of Egypt was a man named Ptolemy Philadelphus. And so he, Antiochus Theos, decided that what he wanted to do was marry the daughter of the king of Egypt. Unfortunately, he was already married. But that was no problem. He divorced his wife, married this daughter of the southern king. Well, his wife wasn't real thrilled about it, so she murdered the new wife. She not only murdered his new wife, but she murdered all her attendants too. And she poisoned Theos to boot. So, okay, you do me that way, I'm gonna do you all much worse. And so that's right. So let me read. I didn't read verse 6. Let me read that, and then verse 7. After some years, they'll form an alliance. The daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. She will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. Of course not. They died. But she will be given up along with those who brought her in, her maidens, and one who sired her as well as he who supported her in those times. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. Okay, what does all that mean? MacArthur writes, so this brought us to the throne a man named Callinicus, but out of a branch of her roots, that is, out of the roots of the murdered wife, whose name was Bernice. There was a man named Ptolemy Euergetes, and it says in verse 7, one shall stand in his estate. Out of the branch of the roots of the murdered wife comes a brother from the south, and he comes with an army. And he comes against Callinicus, and he defeats him. In verse 8 says, he carried away captives into Egypt, took their gods, their princes, their precious vessels, silver, gold, so forth and so on. Now, history tells us all about this. It tells us he took 40,000 talents of silver, 2,500 idol statues, and it goes on and on. And even Callinicus died because he fell off his horse. And there's an interesting note there. At the end of verse 8, it says, the king of the south shall continue more years than the king of the north. And that's exactly what happened. Callinicus fell off his horse, died, and the one in the south continued 4 more years. So again, the detail is just very specific. Okay, verse 10. His sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. His son refers to Callinicus' son, and he had 2 sons. One of his sons died, but the other becomes king of the north. His name was Antiochus the Great. And he assembles an army of 75,000 soldiers, marches toward the king of the south. Verse 11 and 12, the king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. Naturally, the king of the south is enraged. You would too if an army of 75,000 troops marched their way to the border of your country. So Antiochus the Great, the king of the north, cannot defeat Philometor, the king of the south, at this time. He can't withstand him. So verse 13, for the king of the north will again raise a great multitude. 13 years later, Antiochus the Great tried again to go up to the south. So he says, okay, if at first you don't succeed, try again. Verse 14, now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. All right, the violent ones among your people could refer to what MacArthur calls covenant breakers or rebels. Men of violence who break the law, strong-willed, apostate Jews who are revolutionaries. These would be residents of the Holy Land who had remained and who were continuing to be antagonistic toward anybody who wants to come into their land and take control. This would be kind of akin to what Barabbas would be in the first century as a Judaizer, or as one who is there's another name that's I'm missing.
Well, the Maccabees were.
The Maccabees later on, but there's a name for Judas. For Barabbas, but I can't. Rabble rousers comes to mind. That's not it. Anyway, they're like mercenary soldiers, and they join the cause of the king of the north, thinking that the king of the north, if he defeats the king of the south, that the king of the north will deal more favorably with them than the king of the south will. Verse 15 and 16. Zealots, yeah, that's good, Richard. Yeah, maybe that's it. Verse 15, then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. But he will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. So this time Antiochus the Great was victorious, and after this the north took a lasting reign over Palestine. And the beautiful land is Israel, and we first saw this moniker back in Daniel 8:9. So this time Antiochus the Great succeeds, and now they have this lasting hold over the Holy Land. Verse 17, he will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect. He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. To ruin it, yeah. Okay, so Antiochus the Great wanted to, as they say, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So he offers up his daughter, Cleopatra, not the famous one, that's much later on, but Cleopatra, to the king of the south as a sign of good faith or a peace offering. But what he really wanted was to have a spy in the palace. Well, this backfired on him because Cleopatra loved her husband more than her father, confirming that she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. So that backfired on Antiochus the Great there, and she really fell in love with the king of the south. Okay, verse 18. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many. But a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. So Antiochus now decides he wants to broaden his reach, and so he goes after the coastlands. What does that mean? That means Greece. And so the only problem was that Rome now ruled that part of the world. Rome had a hold on that area. And the result of Antiochus' effort was that he now incurred the wrath of Rome that resulted in political hostages to Rome, including Antiochus the Great's own son, Antiochus IV, who we'll see later, and a large tribute, a tribute that Antiochus the Great that would haunt him the rest of his reign and even into the reigns of his successors. So verse 19, so he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be found no more. Wendy Witter writes, a few years later, Antiochus was assassinated when, in an effort to chip away at his debt, he tried pillaging a temple in Persian Elymais. So he's got this massive debt that he owes Rome. It's continuing to weigh him down. He can't progress any. He gets desperate, so he tries to pillage a temple. And that gets him assassinated. All right, verse 20. How's everybody doing? Y'all all right? Hanging with the history? Verse 20. Then in his place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger nor in battle. So that debt to Rome continued to become an albatross on the Seleucid kingdom. The quote unquote, one who will arise here is Seleucus IV Philopator. And he was the son of Antiochus the Great. And so he attempted to pay off the debt to Rome by raising taxes. And that's one of the things that that's a typical way for leaders to try to erase debt is raise taxes. We've seen it here for years. Snaith says this heavy taxation is important because it had as much as any other one thing to do with the reasons for the Maccabean revolt. Now, in Maccabean revolt, we're getting a little ahead, but that's the kind of spark that when the Maccabees revolted against Rome, and out of that was birthed the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees not long after that. And it was really that battle that tried to reclaim Jewish independence. All right, so that's what that was. So Witter writes, Seleucus dispatched his finance minister, Heliodorus, to Jerusalem to confiscate temple funds. Well, you can imagine that didn't work out well. Heliodorus was unsuccessful, and ultimately, in the midst of the fray, or in the midst of the battle back and forth between he and Seleucus, he kills Seleucus. So he was killed not in anger, because Heliodorus is not angry at Seleucus. He's trying to keep himself alive, and he's not killed in battle either, because it was just an independent thing. Okay, verse 21. In his place, a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred. But he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. This despicable person here is the next king of the Seleucids, Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes. This is the son of Antiochus the Great, who had spent 12 years in Rome as a political hostage. So while in Rome, this is important, while he was in Rome, he learned to appreciate their might, and he learned that they were not to be trifled with. So while he spent 12 years in Rome, he learned a lot about the Romans. And later on, it affected the way he ruled, and we'll see that come into play in just a little bit. As to seizing the kingdom by intrigue, Witter, citing a work by Carol Newsom, writes, Seleucus IV sent his son Demetrius I, the rightful heir. Now we're back to Seleucus, not Antiochus IV here, Seleucus. He sent his son Demetrius I, the rightful heir, to Rome in exchange for Antiochus IV. That's pretty tough. send the rightful heir. You're going to take Antiochus's place, and you'll be a hostage, and I'll get Antiochus back. That's got to be a blow, to the sonship there. Before the liberated Antiochus IV arrived back in Syria, Seleucus was killed. So Antiochus mustered an army and seized his brother's throne, displacing the treasonous Heliodorus and eventually marrying his brother's wife, another Laodice. There's several Laodices throughout this, several queens that are Laodice or Laodice. And Antiochus ruled as co-regent with his younger nephew/stepson, who was another Antiochus, another brother, until he and Laodice had their own son. Then young Antiochus was murdered, lest he ever try to replace his uncle/stepfather. So intrigue, right?
So his sons were brother cousins.
Yeah, right, brother. Yeah. And so he seized the kingdom by intrigue. Antiochus Epiphanes did. Okay, verse 22. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. The prince of the covenant here, that could be misleading. Most scholars believe this reference is to the high priest in Jerusalem, Onias II. And it'll be helpful to know, this will clear up some confusion, that the Hebrew word for prince here in verse 22 is a different word than the ones translated as prince in chapter 10 when we were talking about angelic beings. So it's a completely different word. Even though it's translated in English as prince, it simply means ruler. And that's because the high priest in Jerusalem at that time was the control center of power at the time. It was the most powerful position in Jerusalem, was the high priest. And so Onias held that, and so we'll see a little bit about what happens to Onias here in just a second. Verse 23, after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. This more than likely refers to the help that Antiochus Epiphanes received on his way to the throne. Tremper Longman writes, on the way back from Rome, he received the support of Eumenes, the king of Pergamum, who wanted to support the native dynasty over a pretender like Heliodorus. Antiochus, with his help, reached Antioch and ruled for the next 5 years as co-regent. So at least Longman thinks that small force was the king of Pergamum and whatever help he may have given to Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 24, in a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he'll accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. Well, it just so happens that Jerusalem was one of the richest parts of the realm at this time. It had a vast treasure stored in the temple that was overseen by those priests. Factions quickly formed between the standing family of the high priest Onias, who were pro-Egypt, and a rival family, the Tobiads, who were pro-Syrian. So you had these two families, and they fell on different sides. Some of them thought, well, the south takes better care of us, or they leave us alone. Others thought, no, the north is better for us. And so you had these factions that developed. Well, a brother of Onias named Joshua went and met with Antiochus, and through flattery and bribery came away with the royal decree that he would become high priest. So he basically buys the priesthood, the high priesthood, off of Antiochus and undercuts his brother Onias. Joshua even went so far as to change his name to Jason, a Greek name, and promised to further Hellenize Jerusalem. Wendy Witter writes, this purchase of the priesthood was just the beginning of worse corruption in the sacred office. Before long, the non-priestly Tobiads bribed Antiochus IV to replace Jason with one of their relatives, Menelaus, bringing to an end the legitimate Zadokite priesthood. In other words, Onias' family were the ones who had the genetic right to rule, but by the time that Menelaus takes over the priesthood after bribing Antiochus, that kind of ended the reign of legitimate high priests in Jerusalem. As one might expect, Menelaus was no good. Among other things, he stole gold vessels from the temple to pay bribes, and the deposed and disgruntled Onias, the old one, the one that had been deposed, exposed this sacrilege and then took sanctuary in a temple near Antioch. But Menelaus managed to get to him and have him assassinated anyway. So all of these schemes, we see about schemes in verse 24, all that's taking place here. So verses 25 through 29, they detail basically Antiochus' dealings with Egypt as he attempts to gain control over the king of the south. So let me read verses 25 through 29. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war. But he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. Schemes and schemes. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, for they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Now, to try to summarize all this, Witter writes, at the urging of powerful courtiers, Ptolemy VI, who's the king of the south, asserted his power by trying to regain Palestinian territory from the Seleucids. But he did not get far. Antiochus IV's entourage overwhelmed him. They seized Egyptian cities and plundered the land. Rivalry of the control of Egypt may have given Antiochus the false impression that he would somehow get control of Egypt in negotiations. So he had these little footholds in Egypt, and he thought, I've almost got it. I've almost reached down in there. I'm going to get it. But Witter writes, while Antiochus IV was in Egypt, the deposed Jason, remember Jason, Joshua who changed his name to Jason, the high priest, heard a rumor that Antiochus had been killed in battle. Seizing the opportunity to oust Antiochus, the Antiochus-backed Menelaus, Jason invaded Jerusalem with his own army. But Menelaus, barricaded inside the Jerusalem fortress, was out of reach, and a frustrated Jason turned on Jerusalem's citizenry instead. When word of this rebellion reached the very much alive Antiochus, he returned to Palestine in a fury. Jerusalemites were slaughtered, and the temple was plundered. So all of this is happening in the background. And then we read verse 29, but let me read it again. At the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him will arise and desecrate the sanctuary fortress, do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in hypocrisy. Some of those who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. Now, the ships of Kittim, that's a reference to the island of Cyprus, to the west of Antiochus' kingdom, where what Cyprus was under the control of Rome at that time. So this is an entrance by Rome to come in here, and this that confirms that. Let's see, back in, well, I lost it. Well, anyway, it's the entrance of another king. There seems to be a third party there, and maybe I'm reading down into verse 30 or thinking it. So anyway, Witter writes, 2 years later, whatever gains Antiochus IV had made in Egypt had been undone by the reconciliation of the co-regent Ptolemy brothers, prompting the Seleucid king to launch a second attack to regain control of Egypt in 168 BC. However, the Romans, the ships of the western coastlands, had been monitoring Ptolemy-Seleucid relations and determined that in order to maintain the balance of regional power, Antiochus had to be stopped. So they sent Gaius Popilius Linus, I'm not sure, consul of Rome, with an envoy to tell Antiochus to go home. When Antiochus said he would consider it, Pompilius drew a circle round the king with a stick he was carrying and said, "Before you step out of that circle, give me a reply to lay before the Senate." So with no choice left but to obey, a humiliated Antiochus agreed and evacuated Egypt. So you see the pressure put on Rome, but don't forget, Antiochus had spent 12 years in Rome. He knew what they were like. He knew that they were not to be trifled with. And that's why I think he relented there and left. She continues, Antiochus vented his humiliation and frustration to the Jews, who had long been troublesome to him in their resistance to Hellenization and refusal to recognize his divinity. In a brutal attack, his men turned the temple into a pagan shrine, massacred Jews, and burned much of Jerusalem. Gentile priests killed pigs and other unclean animals in the temple precincts as sacrifices to Zeus. Circumcision was outlawed, festivals and Sabbaths were forbidden, and sacred scrolls were burned and their owners killed. And you can read about that in 1 Maccabees if you want more information. If you find yourself a intertestamental or apocrypha or even a Catholic Bible, we'll have that in there. So the remaining verses of chapter 12 here, as we get to verse 36, are difficult, and they're widely debated among scholars. And Dr. John Walvoord, again, I've referenced him, he writes, no commentator claims to find precise fulfillment in the remainder of this chapter, which is bizarre. We've had minute specifics in the first 35 verses, right? Down to the letter. And now from 36 to 45, no scholar can find any widespread agreement on specifics. He says, although Zockler and others attempt to relate Daniel 11:36 through 45 to Antiochus, many students of Scripture have recognized from antiquity that another king must be in view. Ibn Ezra, for example, identified this king with Constantine the Great. Rashi and Calvin referred him to the Roman Empire as a whole, and Jerome, Theodore, and Luther, among others, identified him with the New Testament Antichrist. Although many variations of interpretations exist, in general, interpretations of Daniel 11:36 through 45 fall into three major categories. One, that it's a further historic or prophetic account fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes. Two, that it is fiction, strong word, that is the wishful thinking of the author which does not correspond to history precisely. Or three, that it is genuine prophecy as yet unfulfilled. So really, in my mind, there's really only two options. It's really further about Antiochus Epiphanes, or it's about something else in the future. Whether that's the near future or the far future, don't know. Furthermore, Walvoord explains, the passage, therefore, is to be considered as contemporaneous with the climax of chapter 2, the destruction of the image, and the destruction of the little horn of Daniel 7, a period described in the book of Revelation, chapters 6 through 19. Now, of course, all this from Walvoord is coming from a dispensationalist perspective, that views the events of Revelation as yet to be fulfilled in the end times in a very specific order. Do you know what I mean when I say dispensationalist? Just to, as brief as I can, that there are certain ages that you can trace the history of God's people up until the end times. There's the looking at after the New Testament closes, the church age, and then there's the modern age, and then there's the rapture, and then the tribulation, and then the millennium, and then the eternal kingdom. It all kind of falls out into nice little neat dispensations, and it sounds real good. It looks good on a chart. Is it reality? I don't know. I can't be dogmatic about it. It's possible. Could all end up that way. I don't mean to say this harshly when I say it, but I believe that's an invention of man. I think man came up with that. I don't know that it's necessarily biblical. 36 through 45 here. Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. Women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. Regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead he will a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him. Let's see, hold on. Sorry.
It's not recorded, that's good. So you have the rest.
Yeah. Good idea, Luis. Okay. All right, verse 38. But instead he will honor God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. He will take action against the strongest foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him. Price. At the end time, the king of the south. At the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him. The south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, and with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. And he will enter countries with many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. He will